you, Adnan Hussein. That was the nicest introduction I have ever received. Seriously. Thank you, History Department, for the invitation. Thank you, Hina Mistry and Kathy Dickinson for logistical help. I should be standing in front of the mic. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you to my students. I recognize several of you here. I told you I wouldn't be taking attendance, but it's really nice to see you here. Anyway, especially thank you, and I see a couple of you students from other departments. You really didn't have to come here, so thank you. And finally, a very special thanks to my son, Jordy, who is here, trying to be inconspicuous at the back. When I told him about this event, and that I would mostly be showing images of children, he said, well, that doesn't sound too boring. And so here he is. And so, thank you, Jordy, for coming. Thank you, Jordy, for your all of your inspiration. And I promise to try not to be too boring. Okay, this invitation gave me an opportunity to pick up a project that I've been working on for some years. And it's literally something, it's like, you know, people who are part-time knitters. I pick it up and then I put it down and I do something else and then I pick it up again. So there's been a lot of picking up and putting down. Tonight, it was good to pick it up again for tonight because it gave me a chance to revisit archives that have been collected for actually quite some time now. And so it was good to be to refamiliarize myself with the archives. I really, literally am going to be showing you a lot of pictures of children. My overall and most basic point is to illustrate that images of children contain tremendous meaning and mobilizing power. As I look at these pictures, some of the questions that I ask are, who is being mobilized? By what means? What range of emotions might be being evoked? Who or what is doing the mobilizing? So let's start with a couple of recent examples that will be instantly familiar to you. This one hardly needs an introduction. Of course, it's Alan Kurdi, a Syrian child who died in Turkey, changed the course of a national election in Canada, and arguably influenced a global conversation about refugees. This one is also famous. Ahmed Mohammed, here handcuffed by police at his high school in Texas a couple of months ago when the homemade clock that he brought to show his teacher was mistaken for a bomb. He quickly became a domestic poster child for a related conversation, Islamophobia and the suspicions of Muslims of any age in many parts of the world. These are just two recent examples of the political importance of symbolic children. I began thinking about symbolic children several years ago as I was writing the book that Adnan just mentioned about adoption and child migration conflicts, which drew from examples in Canada, Cuba, and Guatemala. More than anything I've done before, this research really made me aware of the centrality of images in historical research, in this case in shaping these controversies that I was looking at, adoption and migration controversies. Photographs of white families with their newly adopted black children were tremendously popular in Canadian periodicals in the 1960s. These images told a liberal integrationist story of interracial adoption, which positioned black children with white parents as innocent bearers of racial reconciliation. Here, Canadians saw hopeful signs of cross-racial tolerance and a measure of our superior social values. It drew on and helped to solidify long-standing tropes of Canadian liberal, colorblind nationalism. As black children in the US were being harassed on their way to integrated schools, black Canadian kids were, apparently, being embraced, literally, in white families. It's an iconography that helped to subsume the complications of adoption under the veneer of Canadian civil rights era progress. Thorny questions, for example, the circumstances of black birth parents, simply vanish. It's a discourse of self-congratulatory evasion about racism in Canada that Canadians have perfected. Contemporary international adoption is characterized, I think, by similar kinds of stories. The self-preservation of virtually every international adoption agency in the world looks something like this. Cute, young babies, always depicted alone. In what I call the fantasy of the global cabbage patch, we in the first world are encouraged to imagine a world of babies devoid of community or history or social origin or biological origin, waiting for our loving intervention. The history of adoption from Guatemala, which was another one of my case studies, provides some tremendous examples of this. This is a t-shirt that was available on a U.S. adoption agency website until a few years ago, when Guatemala finally passed an Adoption Reform Act. And just to offset that image, I want to give you a couple of examples of how Guatemalans themselves responded to this idea that North Americans, Western Europeans were going to come and quote-unquote rescue their children. I want to give you a couple of examples of how Guatemalans responded. These are both images from the campaign to press for the adoption law. It was a long time coming, but it finally came. This is the cover of the Canadian version of my book, and the ubiquitous baby with a barcode that I used for this was actually something that was really popular, used on placards and banners and all kinds of advertising by the adoption reform movement in Guatemala. Curiously, it's not a very Guatemalan-looking baby, but the image was really popular, and you can see very powerful. I guess the major conclusion that I came to in this project was to think past the conflict, the binary of kidnap versus rescue in our analysis of international adoption. It's something that I came to believe was analytically a dead end, but rescue retains the idea that rescue is what child welfare is all about. That retains a central hold on the popular imagination, I think because of the tremendous cultural work that children do in our world. My interest in the symbolic importance of children also came from my new teaching field. As Adnan mentioned, I took up a cross appointment in the Department of Global Development Studies in 2009, and one of my responsibilities there has been to teach a very large introductory class, Introduction to Development Studies, Canada and the Third World. So as I've retooled myself in the field of development studies, I've come to appreciate the centrality of children, real and imagined, to debates about economic and social progress the world over. Today, nations are increasingly judged by their ability to provide their citizens a universal, normative, and very tightly defined thing that we call childhood. That's the premise of UNICEF's annual State of the World's Children report that comes out, in which children act as development indices. In this publication, as with virtually every fundraising effort by non-governmental organizations, the awfulness of the statistical portrait of global poverty is highlighted by moving images of children. Now, art history, I don't need to point out, always depicted alone. Art historians tell us that pictures of children are at once the most common, the most sacred, and the most controversial images of our time. But beside historians of Western art, surprisingly few scholars have studied the image of the child. This book I like because it's a rare study of children in a wide range of popular iconography. And Patricia Holland argues that contemporary childhood, not historical, it's more contemporary, is imagined by adults as a space beyond conflict, an image that smooths over adult problems. We equate children almost solely with emotion. Because of this, when children symbolize a story, or an ideology, or a social movement, or an event, or a war, they explain very little, but they can move emotional and psychic mountains. Scholar Robin Bernstein is one of an increasing number of child studies scholars who are asking us to consider how childhood acquired so much effective weight. As she says, the exhortation to protect the children seems to add persuasive power to almost any argument. So these are some of the issues that I've taken with me to this next project. I've been searching the archives of the world's political posters to collect images of children generated by social movements, political parties, and nation states. Now, I don't know the provenance of this, I don't know the origins of this. 10 minutes ago, Rebecca translated it for me. I think it came from a very suspect source, and that's why I will probably research it. I don't know what I'm going to find. I think it's a joke or an irony, but maybe it's for real. However, I love the image, and someday I hope to use it as a book cover, whether it's real, historically accurate, no, historically real or not. I made a series of decisions about focusing broadly on gathering an archive of posters as much as possible, obviously within financial, etc., limitations, from all over the world, instead of doing what some people have done, which is to focus on one time or one place or one event. There are gains and losses, strengths and weaknesses to this approach. One of them is that it's probably going to take me 20 years to write this book, but I'm not in a hurry. I'm using these images to analyze and make transnational comparisons and generalizations about how children sustain political movements and causes and events. And I'm also trying to explore the global knowledge about childhood, which this visual archives has helped to create. There's a good news study by historian Margaret Peacock, which we just talked about this week in class, actually, about how symbolic children were mobilized in the US and the USSR to sustain the Cold War. She discusses how imagery, and she uses a wide range of images, not just posters, is, excuse me, as she calls it, a set of visual tropes that transform seeing into believing. Posters, which have been the visual idiom of politics for over a century, try to do the same thing. Children are represented in order to make something believable and then to encourage action. So let me give you a very quick survey of the kinds of images that I've encountered. Then I'm going to pause on my last chapter that is specifically about children themselves as political actors, and I'm going to leave the page and talk about a social experience for the last bit. So I'm not going to talk through these. I'm going to explain these categorizations. Someday, in the very distant future, these may emerge as chapters. I imagine that these will emerge as chapters for a book. The first one being probably the best known set of images that probably, I'm sure all of you have seen some version of these, probably literally some of these. But children's presence in war and peace are very, very common in images of war and peace. This is very, very well known. Lots of you will know this one in the quote question. And babies? Yes, and babies. That comes from a quote, or that comes from an interview between CBS's Mike Wallace, U.S. journalist, and a U.S. soldier who was part of this massacre. Did you kill the babies too? Yes, we killed the babies too. the second chapter, again, I found images that are fairly well known, and certainly the genre, I would say, is fairly well known. Particularly what I think of as literally almost a distinct genre, the triad of the woman, the revolutionary fighter, and the baby, and the gun. And she shows up in countries all over the world, at different times, especially in the post-colonial era, more or less post-World War II era. You could write a book about her alone. The woman who cradles baby and gun, for whom the baby, I think, kind of authorizes the gun. I like this one because of how it kind of, I think it draws from and in some ways interrupts or maybe mimics that woman-baby gun image. These are two sides of the Nicaraguan conflict of the 1980s, the Sandinistas on the one side and what was called the Nicaraguan resistance on the other, both of them showing men, soldiers, armed men, cradling or educating babies, doing that woman-baby gun thing, but men doing it, except I think the guy over here is breastfeeding that baby. So I'll just go through some more of the revolution, national liberation ones. Not all, some with guns, some without. If there was a contest for who in the world did the best posters, political posters, I think the Soviets and the Chinese would be tied neck and neck. They're really, and there's tons of publications as well. These are drawn from archival images, but there's been plenty of secondary sources on both of them as well. Okay, children and elections or political parties. Politicians kiss babies famously for a reason. And here's just a few examples of that, variations on more or less the same theme. This one, I grouped together things that, I still have trouble figuring out if this is exactly the right grouping, but what I tried to do is group together domestic and international development images, because I think they say the same thing. I think what they illustrate is the way in which children become measures of social or economic development, whether that's understood, quote unquote, at home or abroad. And then something that we could call children's issues, a relatively recent concept that conceptualized that way, which is about the rights that we imagine children should have or ought to have. both as an idea, the images themselves are less well known, and certainly not so plentiful, but I find them interesting in all kinds of ways in their uniqueness. The idea that children can actually be participants themselves in some fashion, whether it be throwing rocks. Now this is obviously a poster that's opposed to the arming, that children are armed, making an argument about children with guns, making an argument about the rights of man, about jailing, imprisoning children. That rock could be being passed either way, but in whichever direction that rock is going, it implies something about the political actions of a child, a girl, in fact, a girl. Children as participating in the Amnesty International letter writing campaign. Children embodying the rights of indigenous people, not children, people, to migrate. Now I'm cheating here a bit. This isn't actually a poster, it's an ad from a Cuban magazine right after the revolution, but you'll see why I wanted to use a Cuban example in a moment. As Uncle Sam is leaning over and fondling a sweet little girl, the little boy is lighting firecrackers that are going to go up his butt. This one is, I think, remarkable. One of the only posters I've seen that imagines a sexual identity, a potential sexual identity for a child, for a baby. And then finally, I love the self-conscious irony of this one. It's a big responsibility for a boy my age. I'm barely 5 years old and already I'm the future of the homeland. I don't know the context for it from the Argentinian government, Ministry of Culture, but I think it says something actually that's relevant to many of the images that we've looked at. So clearly, children have been hiding in plain sight in the world's political posters for a century or so, and yet except for this last chapter, there's very little in the presence of children in these posters that would challenge, I think, our common sense understandings of childhood, or at least in their hegemonic Western meaning of childhood. Children represent innocence, weakness, vulnerability, and purity. Many years ago, John Berger said famously that in the Western art tradition, men act and women appear. In the world's political posters, children appear so that adults can act. They protect, they lead, they fight, they win, they change, they make a better future. The appearance of children as political actors in their own right, holding a gun, holding a stone, raising a fist, it's unusual and sometimes troubling because it challenges a fundamental truth of our world. To quote political scientist Helen Brocklehurst, the concept of the political, the concept of what we think of as the political, is formulated to and projected as if it were separate from children. As I explained, I made the decision to look very broadly, and so I haven't researched the origin of every single image, nor will I. I will do some, but certainly it's not possible to do every one in my sample. One of the limitations of this widescreen approach is that I can't thoroughly embed or anchor these images in the society that produced them. I don't know the specific origin story of every image, but I think we can safely assume that the vast majority, at least, of these posters were made by adults. So we could simply conclude, therefore, that even these images of children as political actors are just another example of an adult imagination, and just leave it at that. I think that would be too simple, because I think that would miss something very important that lurks just below this surface. A central tension on the historian of childhood looks something like this. Is childhood a category of a historical analysis that produces and manages adult power? In other words, is childhood an imposed notion, a notion that is imposed on one group of people by another group of people? Or do the complicated lives of young people constantly grapple, constantly change or challenge abstract ideas about childhood? In other words, children are present at their own creation, much as E.P. Thompson suggested the working class was at its own creation. There's a trace of what I think of as the Goldilocks approach to children and politics in the Western imagination. We think that it's only the extremes that politicize children. Children in the Nazi world or the communist world don't have a proper childhood because they've been politicized by ideology, which is always understood as manipulation. Children in the third world don't have a proper childhood because they've been denied it by poverty, which is always understood as a negation. Meanwhile, we in Europe and North America got it just right. So in general, I think that the concept of childhood, as it's typically been deployed by adults, is in fact often disempowering for younger humans. And I want to introduce you now to some people whose youthful experiences challenge any simple or neat division between adult and childhood. So here, as I said, we're going to leave the page for a moment and reconnect with social experience. These are 3 retired professors from the University of Havana. Another of my undergrad teaching commitments is a course called Cuban Culture and Society, which takes place one part at Queens and one part at the University of Havana. I co-teach this course with Professor Lord from Film Studies, who's here. In Havana, our instructors are an array of professors and cultural producers, artists, musicians, filmmakers, but the panel that we have annually with these 3 instructors, I have to say, is always a hit. They visit our class annually to speak about their experiences as brigadistas, teaching rural Cubans how to read during the Cuban literacy campaign of 1961. They're all interesting people, but I'm going to focus on one of them who I work more closely with. This is Dr. Inez Rodriguez, who has recently retired from the philosophy department at the U of Havana. Let me tell you just a couple of words about the Cuban literacy campaign. At a meeting of the UN in September 1960, Fidel Castro has just come to power. He announces his government's intention to eliminate illiteracy in Cuba within a year. So to that end, in 1961, they closed the schools early for the summer, and over 100,000 students, most of them from Havana, volunteered to teach literacy to people in rural areas. 52% of them are female, the brigadistas, the teachers, 40% between the ages of 10 and 14, and 47% are younger than 19. One of them was Inez de la Caridad Rodriguez Pedroso, a 16-year-old Afro-Cuban girl who had never left her hometown of Havana before. She was working class. Her father worked in a warehouse in Old Havana. She was the youngest of these 4 girls. By her own account, she was, and I'm quoting her, pampered, timid, and whiny. They were by no means wealthy, but the girls were all educated, church-going Catholics. Clearly, they had the occasional trapping of what we would recognize as a childhood, a television, and a doll, which she named Roberta. But my Cuban mentor, Professor Inez Rodriguez, and my Canadian mentor, who's here, Professor Roberta Hamilton, share this odd historical bond is, to me, an amazing and adorable irony. Like many of their class, Inez's family were avid supporters of the social reforms ushered in by the revolutionary government, which is why Inez didn't hesitate to exchange her quinceañera dress for the military fatigues issued to volunteer teachers. Now, sadly, I'm not trying to pass this miscellaneous Afro-Cuban girls off as Inez. This is not from Inez's family. Sadly, she doesn't have any photographs of herself from this era, at least from the Brigadista part of this era. After a week of group training, she found herself stationed in the small village of Giza in the foot of the Sierra Maestra Mountains in eastern Cuba. It was, in a small country like Cuba, about as far away from home as it was possible to be. She spent the next year teaching people, children, women, and men, how to read. At the official end of the campaign in December 1961, thousands of these teachers returned to Havana for a big celebration, and here you can see that they asked Fidel to give them another chance. It's hard not to like the Cuban literacy campaign, perhaps especially so for a room full of educators like ourselves. While some people criticized the highly politicized curriculum, to many others it was and remains a great and noble accomplishment. Even historians who are critical of various policies of the Cuban Revolution find something admirable in this massive conscription of voluntary child labor. Most recently, scholars and filmmakers have focused on how the use of this very obvious, firmly militarized framework for the campaign authorized women's participation in the nation-building project of the early years of the Revolution. This is a new documentary, relatively new documentary, that focuses on women's participation in the campaign. We use it for our class. It's a very good way to introduce this to students. She's an American filmmaker, and I've been working with her putting together the archives of the interviews that we've done. She did a number of interviews with former teachers for this project. Young women, and I know Susan Lord loves this image, young women wielding pencils rather than rifles certainly inspires the imagination. I've actually concluded that for young female teachers like Inez, this wasn't just a metaphor for the military campaign associated with a revolution, this was a revolution. So the gender politics of all this is pretty fascinating, but so too are the politics of childhood, and that's what I'll end with. Last December, Inez and I had the immense good fortune to return, I had the good fortune to go. She returned to the village of Giza 50 years after her time teaching there. She'd never been back since. Every year the Brigadistas come and talk to our students in Havana. Somebody always asks, this is such a great story, have you gone back? Do you keep in touch with your students? And the answer is no. It's not easy to move around in Cuba, and any disposable income is probably not going to go on plane fare to go to rural Giza. So she'd never been back with, so we cooked up this project in order to do some research there, and it was a mind-blowing experience for me to be able to get to observe this. We were there literally a year ago, and right after this talk, I'm heading to the airport to spend a couple of more weeks in Havana, not sadly in Giza, but in Havana with Inez to work on this archive that we collected last year. Returning with a brigadista to rural eastern Cuba was a bit like hanging out with a rock star. The response was overwhelming. She was interviewed by local media. She gave a talk at the local museum. Every time we turned around, somebody gave her an award. But the best thing that happened were the conversations that we were able to have with just random various people in Giza about their memories of sometimes about their memories of her, about their memories of the literacy campaign. We spoke to people on the street and in their houses and in cars and in buses, sometimes in old age homes, and we heard some really sometimes very sophisticated, very knowledgeable analyses of just how uncommon this campaign had been. As Daniel, the guy sitting on the rocking chair, this is in one of the old age homes where we had group interviews, as he explained, the light came on in 1961. The old government didn't want us to read so that they could trick us better. This man, Luis, remembers the exact details about the day that the campaign officially ended and the brigadistas left the village because, he said, everyone cried when they said goodbye. Manuel Lopez was a fellow teacher. He and Inez actually remembered each other from their time at the training school in Havana. almost 50 years previously. He began teaching as a volunteer brigadista when he was in the 5th grade, which led to a lifelong career in education. As a person, I'm not proud, he said, but I'm proud of the work I've done, meaning he helped to educate 4 kids, his own kids. Ernesto Gonzalez echoed these sentiments, reciting the educational accomplishments of all of his children and grandchildren as examples of the lifelong impact for him of the literacy campaign. This is one of Ernesto's former students, now his neighbor, Ana Maria Osorio. Her father had a small coffee farm. The kids all worked on the farm. No one went to school. 2 brigadistas came and lived with the family and taught everyone, children and parents alike. After that, she was selected to go to Havana and learn a trade, sewing, as was common for young women. When I asked her the first words she learned how to write, she smiled at me. Mama, Papa, Fidel, Revolution. Perhaps sensing my surprise, the smile became a stare. I adore Fidel, she told me. This guy, Rafael Manzo, was sent to live with a family in an isolated village to teach them to read when he was 11 years old. My parents were very revolutionary, he said. They knew the necessity, so they let me go. This woman told us, she's sitting on the front porch with her husband, she told us that learning to read, it was like opening your eyes. The first thing she read was the Bible. Her neighbor, Rosa Calzado, saw us on the front porch and invited us in because she too had a story to tell. She was taught to read when she was 15. She worked as a cook, and she said, when I learned to read, I couldn't be tricked. If something cost 5 cents, I wanted correct change. Paula Escribano also continued as a teacher after she'd been a brigadista. She continued a lifelong career in teaching. She remembered, though, her time as a very young, I think she was 11, 12-year-old brigadista, as the best teaching she ever had. She said, because old people want to learn, and they really respected us, even though we were so young. There are accounts of brigadistas who were 6 or 7 years old. So almost everyone we spoke to commented on the youth of the brigadistas, but they did this not to apologize for it, but rather to underscore the value of the contribution. The campaign inverted social hierarchies, urban and rural, male and female, black and white, young and old. Age was just one of several hierarchies that was kind of thrown up into the air. Cuban-American historian Lillian Guerra has recently observed that the literacy campaign offered an unprecedented degree of cross-race and cross-class interaction, especially since most of the teachers, or most of the brigadistas were from Havana, the whitest and richest part of the country, and most of the students were in the east, the poorest and blackest part of the country. What was striking to me as I listened to those memories is that people wove age into their stories, but fundamentally this history was told as something Cubans did for each other or for themselves as citizens, and that included children and youth. The government of the day, the revolutionary government, framed high rural illiteracy rates as one more consequence of generations of corrupt political leadership and foreign exploitation and control, which was felt much more profoundly in rural areas. So there was no question that teaching poor people to read was a political act. It wasn't merely a technical issue or a pedagogical issue. The campaign combined elements of going to war with something like going to a summer youth camp, but in wartime, unlike in wartime, being a brigadista wasn't considered an aberration from the course of normal childhood. Recall the slogan from the returning army who paraded through Havana asking, what do we do next? This wasn't about going back to normal after a national trauma. I've had a number of conversations with Inez about the impact of this experience on her generation when they returned home. Speaking personally, she immediately linked it to her own parenting style. She raised her children much more independently, she says, than she was raised. She gave them credit for more intelligence, more judgment than her parents had ever given her as a child, and she traces that to many things, including her own experiences of independence that she got through participation in the literacy campaign. She also sees it as historically contextual. Her granddaughter, who's now 15, was raised in a different era. I can't imagine her doing what I did at that age, she told me recently, because she is the same kind of timid, fussy girl that I used to be. So I'll end with a few questions. What are the historical circumstances that produce children with self-conscious understandings of their political dreams or their political duties? What would happen to the adult-child binary if we widened our imagination about children and political citizenship or political capabilities? What would our image archive look like if the full spectrum of political actors were represented, and perhaps represented by themselves as well? I'll leave you with this image, which I came across just recently. It's from a Guatemalan organization called Hijos Guatemala. It translates as Sons of Guatemala, but the full name is Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Oblivion and Silence. It's an organization of Guatemalan children whose parents have been disappeared, have been taken by the military and disappeared, which is a bit of a euphemism. There's also an Argentinian chapter of this group, Hijos Argentina. One of the things that Hijos does is paint murals and graffiti around Guatemala City, keeping the historical memory of the Guatemalan Civil War alive, publishing continued abuses of Guatemalan children and youth, and reminding everyone, as this image clearly does, that we ignore the political force of children at our peril. That's it. So now what's supposed to happen?
I assume we can take some questions.
Certainly. I don't want to stand between you and the bar, but I'm happy to take questions.
You talk about the woman with the gun and the child. You talk about the woman with the gun and the child. And then you showed you images of the child with the gun alone.
Mm-hmm.
The child. Shoulders. Soldiers. Child soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about any comparisons between? It seems that was acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
When it was a mother and her child. And unacceptable. When it was just the child.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think, and it's not just me that thinks this, people have written about the mother, the woman, mother, child, gun triad as always in, at least as far as I've seen, in moments of post-colonial wars. Maybe I could be wrong about that, but that's what's in my mind. That the presence of the woman and the child, in some ways, I think, kind of almost like balance each other out. Women aren't supposed to have guns, and children aren't supposed to have guns, but mothers defending their children with a gun kind of changes that story somewhat. I think. I think that's a plausible way of thinking about it. Children with guns alone are, I think, more raise more issues, are more complicated. The image, it's interesting that you use the phrase child soldiers, because I think you made me realize something that in our era, in this moment, I think the not the only imagination, but the first thing when we think about when we see the child gun image is the way in which the narrative of child soldiers today is children are always forced into, right? And that, I'm not saying it's not true. Of course, there's plenty of examples in which that's true, but there's also plenty of examples historically in which children volunteer, in which it's a bit like the child labor debate, right? Not all child labor at all times, at all places, is experienced by children as wholly and thoroughly oppressive. And so we've got a kind of a thanks largely to the way in which the kind of Western childhood, through things like the development project, has been universalized as this is the norm, right? This is what a good childhood is. The idea of a child alone with a gun, we imagine, is solely coercive, and I don't think that's not always true. So that's how I would answer that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes, Hina.
I just had a question about, it's sort of just a general curiosity question, but you said that you couldn't, there's no way that you'd be able to anchor each image into its own particular context just because of the whole scope of the project. But I was just wondering, and also considering that you said that the temporal parameters of the project seem to be one century, would you, do you think that this is, then the project is maybe not anchoring them in their own particular context, but viewing them as is there a larger process that this is indicative of this use of, heightened use of children in propaganda?
Well, that's kind of it was a tough decision, and it's not something that I'm really settled about. But I really wanted to look broadly. I wanted to see if the image of children in the political posters and the political iconography of the Russian Revolution had anything to do with the iconography of the Sandinista, right? There's just so many. It's so ubiquitous. And there's some, there's not that much, but there's some things that are going to help me to anchor it. There's a very good, very, very good book about political posters of the Russian Revolution plus the Soviet era. There's I don't have a good handle yet on all the secondary stuff, and I am taking my time. This new stuff is coming out all the time. And so I don't feel like I'm completely up in outer space, but I'm kind of willingly and self-consciously up in outer space in order to do exactly that, in order to try to get a bird's eye view of how things look in a transnational sense, but also how in both their similarities and their differences. So that's it's not an easy decision, but that's what that's giving me. Yeah.
If I can follow on from that question, because and maybe this reveals something interesting. There's some images where you sort of think it's unproblematically a child because they're lower age, but there's these other images where you're getting into the 16, 15, 16, 17, and then that raises the question: is across cultural boundaries, is that teenagehood still childhood?
Yeah. And that's why I've been working with a number of student researchers, and my only advice or my counsel to them when they say, well, what's a child? I say, if you think the image looks like a child, then save it. If there's any ambiguity, if there's any doubt, save it. And for exactly that reason, that what the definition of a child, that's the whole point of the story, right? The definition of a child is cross-cultural and transnational as well, right? It's different in different countries. And so that's another part of my self-doubt, I suppose, about the inability to completely anchor, is that I'm going to have to kind of go skate a little bit over the surface of that question when it's issues that look like they're on the border, right? And when I'm very conscious of how the topic of children really throws into the air any kind of certainties, definitional certainties we have. I mean, I come out of women's history. There's a lot that debate happens in women's history as well. It happened in women's history. It continues to. But I think there's something even more. There's the question of what is a child is even more ambiguous and has more layers, has more nuances. Yes, Emma.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I mean, just especially as somebody who's done so much work on the 60s, the global 60s. I mean, if there was ever a period where you might say concept of youth as a politically relevant and dynamic category was created, it would be the 60s.
Sure.
And it is the sort of definition of youth in that kind of a context really just the elevation and distinction between childhood by creating a kind of category of younger adult in order to allow for the possibility of politics in it. I mean, it was perhaps radical at the time too, in some ways. But you know, is there a kind of way in which the binary of child and childhood and innocence on the one hand, and in this case not adulthood, but at least sort of proto-adulthood or not quite a child anymore, allows it to be politics.
Well, I think I see what you're saying, except I think youth as a major mobilizing political force is not a product of the 60s, but of course it got, there was a great deal of energy and emphasis about that in the 60s. But the teenager wasn't an invention of the 60s. The teenager has a longer history, more early 20th century history. And, if Professor Mary Louise Adams, who's an expert on this from kinesiology and health studies, wrote an entire book on definitions of children and sexuality, or youth and sexuality, who argues that the post-World War II era, at least in the North American context, that's where that binary, this sort of child-adult sexual innocence, firm line between the two, that got more complicated 50 or 60 years ago. So I think there's more complications than that, for sure. David.
One of the things that you showed us but didn't emphasize, I think, as much, you saw all the images of sort of, children as symbols of innocence.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the sort of the Israeli propaganda thing of what happens when ideology takes that innocence away too soon.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there's a very strong kind of alternative stereotype of the child whose innocence is, for whatever reason, taken away too soon, becomes the sort of Lord of the Flies monster that we see in, for example, the children in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or in very young Shining Path militants. The stereotype is that children who are propagandized from too young become far more brutal and far more amoral and immoral than even evil adults. And I was wondering, are you going to confront that question, not just as an image, but also the whole question of the reality of this? It must be psychological literature. Are you going to
No, that's really interesting. Because I'm kind of, I'm taking my cues from the images and going from there, and there's not, I've yet to see that hinted at or represented at all, but of course who would, right?
It was in the Israeli
okay.
It was clearly there.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if I'd put it, I didn't see that as a Lord of the Flies image. I saw that as this is what the other, this is what those guys are doing.
And these people are being turned into terrorist monsters.
Yeah. No, for sure. You gave me something to think about. I want to think about it in terms of the, that Israeli poster, that's the, I'm hesitating because I'm running through my own Rolodex of images, but that may be the only one where I've seen an armed child be used not to celebrate, my cause, but to condemn your cause, and that bears more thinking about, for sure. Thank you.
I'm really fascinated. I'm particularly fascinated by what, in fact, James was talking about. But so, how do you get at the viewer? I look at those, women, child, gun.
Mm-hmm.
It's the save the women and children, right? So save the women and children by definition are unable to save themselves.
Mm-hmm.
do you think those posters are intended to celebrate the women who are willing to take their children, which is what I would see, all of that, which actually means it has a very limited life. We only celebrate until such time as we have won, but we don't know when we do. And I don't know what the answer is, and it gets back to this question of being rooted. What is the intention of the image as well as how is it intended to be read?
Sometimes it's easier to answer that question when, for example, and I think I showed some examples in the 80s, 70s and 80s especially, images, apartheid era South Africa images turn up in the archives of Belgium and Australia and Canada, all over the world, right? So clearly that tells us something about who the audience was. This was about solidarity or fundraising or political mobilization of Canadians, not South Africans. And so that, when it's something like that, then that, that's another level of analysis, of thinking about. I think those, again, I would say cautiously it depends on who the intended audience is. I don't always know that, sometimes I do. But I think those are celebratory images, except for the one David pointed out, the Israeli one.
I think very much celebratory. But limited. We celebrate this moment, not a general...
It's not like what I'm arguing that I saw in the Cuban literacy campaign. That's more of, this is the expediency of wartime. This is it may be a celebration of the strength of the Angolan woman, but nobody, I don't think anybody, I think it's a moment.
Also these issues of the big picture versus the different cultures, the different nations, the different times. How do you guard against using the word children when that may not in fact be what's being depicted? It may be a particular being, a particular gender, a particular... So how do you guard against the category flattening?
Well, when I was thinking of in the more analytical part, I realized I was using myself. I was saying like younger humans, which is awkward and kind of weird sounding, right? But I don't. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. Like in terms of a word, in terms of actual words to use, that is a difficulty. I suppose when I'm trying to make that, if I'm trying to emphasize that this is the age, or not even the age, the cultural location of this person, this image, is up for grabs. It's ambiguous. Then I think I just have to keep saying that, right? I don't think there's any way around it other than showing an awareness of it.
How do you deal with pictures that fit into more than one category? Because it seems
Oh,
like there might be some
such a good question.
it's
Boy, there's a good grad student question.
I don't know what I would do.
At this point, I'm actually doubling up in my. So if I don't want to forget, or if I change my mind, right? We always change our mind as we go through, and these beautiful or beautifully organized chapters start looking ridiculous. So never hide anything, right? Never put something in a drawer where you're never going to find it again. Never hide anything. Double up if you think there's any kind of ambiguity about it. That's okay. These are just our own notes, right? They're just reminders for ourselves. But yes, and you know what I noticed? Actually this time as I was updating this, I thought, why am I making a distinction between images of war and peace and national liberation? What did I call it? Anti-colonial national, whatever. Like, that's not really a distinction. I mean, I'm making it a distinction for reasons that I'll have to think more about. But no, that's always the case with our research notes or how we make categories. Maybe especially so if our parameters are wider and there's more possibilities. Yes.
During your discussion, you briefly stated that there are potentially posters that are made by adults using children, or sometimes featuring children made by children.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if you found a substantial number of posters made by children featuring children, and if so, in your finished product, do you intend to distinguish between the two? Say, for example, whereas posters made by adults featuring children or using children as something of a political commodity, whereas posters with children, made by children, is more of an act of hypothetically agency as opposed to quantization.
I'll say a trend. There's been some work done by anthropologists who look at the ways in which children in all kinds of locations all over the world now are encouraged to express themselves artistically, to draw stories of bad experiences, of conflicts, of wars, of things that they've lived through, and sometimes those kinds of images make their way onto posters of political movements, right? That you're probably, some of you, I don't think I put it on there because it was just, everybody's seen this, that poster that says war is not healthy for children and other living things, that often has a sun, or it has a child's drawing. I assume it's a real child's drawing. It may be just to represent, somebody's imagination of how children draw. So there is that kind of work of taking children's visual depictions of their lives, taking them seriously, to study something, to study whatever. It's a bit surprising to me, and maybe they just haven't made it into the archives that of the world's political posters. And there are some major collections, most of which are online, which is why a person sitting in Kingston, Ontario, could do a project like this. But fewer of those kinds of images have actually made it into the canon, let's say, of what political posters are. Maybe that's, I think that's actually a relatively new phenomenon, so maybe it will take time. Mm-hmm.
If I'm not jumping in, that makes me think that question is, coming from my own background, is one of the places where young people sometimes get politicized, and it's probably more in Europe, but I think in the way that these communities have gone global in some ways is music and so those teenage. And so one place that could be, that's a space where politics and art intersect are like punk rock posters and these sorts of things. Because growing up, I was politicized by these communist punk bands handing out Maoist and Marxist tracts that shows when I was 12 years old. So it was like, that's maybe a location for where to see, children giving their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have again made a very tough decision that I'm looking at stuff that's generated by movements or sometimes by government when it's war posters or wartime imagery. I decided to avoid the cultural realm, film posters, stuff like that. Not only because we need to put our work in boxes somehow. But you're quite right. That would really work. Yes.
One of the things that strikes me about images, and especially about children, is an important way to decide if someone is a child is to see how they dress. Mm-hmm. So there's a long history of the garment industry actually creating childhood, because children are supposed to dress in nice frocks and shorts, and when you become an adult you wear trousers or you dress like a woman. And one of the things that I constantly noticed in a lot of the posters that you shared today was that whenever there was any display of children exercising their own agency, they often dressed like adults. So I thought if you can touch upon that aspect of children's agency, but that agency being performed in a way that adults think should be channeled by dressing up like adults.
Well, the one, and there's something I have to say. There's something really fantastic about looking at one's own image archives on a big screen, because I'm used to looking at these on my computer, right? And even I put on my big screen when I'm doing them, but I'm noticing things on a big screen that I actually didn't see before. And one of them is one of those ones where I think it's the Palestinian one, where there's a female and she's maybe passing a rock or maybe receiving a rock. She was female and she was in what are these called? Pigtails, red braids, which is that's an infantilizing, let's say, kind of depiction, I think. Aside from that, I want to go back and look at those again, because that's actually not something that I had given thought to in terms of the specific depiction of the figure of the child when they're doing something unchildlike.
I wonder if you could comment more. I
Oh,
the
absolutely.
campus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
These posters
Yeah.
circulate transnationally.
Yes,
They're
yes.
influenced by each other.
Yeah, as we talked about in Mary Checkstier's, who just
Right.
defended a
Yeah.
dissertation here
Yes.
on that included a chapter with, on
Yeah.
war posters, and you can really see those. Yes, absolutely.
And yet, as the questions are sort of suggesting, there's, and which was of tension any time when tries to do history like this, there's this sort of specificity. And I'm thinking, you have that division of sort of war and peace, and then the revolutionary movements. And when I think of the place of the figure of children in these revolutionary posters
Mhm.
is almost never the figure of a victim. At least if I think of the Russian revolutionary posters.
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
it is the figure of somebody who's maybe there's a grandmother trying to hold her back,
Yeah,
and there's
yeah.
the child
Yeah.
reaching towards the school.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
but the child is generally portrayed as active.
Yes.
This is not the child is not victim. The child is the future. The
Yeah,
child is
yeah, yeah, yeah,
um,
definitely.
and the war posters clearly are very, there's, the notion of the victim is very strong. And I wondered if you could, I've been teaching this course in hunger, and we read material about, Save the Children Fund, and this is obviously, this 20th century story is a key moment for
Yeah.
the emergence of the child as
Yeah.
a central focal point.
Yeah.
It does seem like you're dealing with sort of humanitarian organizations as well. You have the UNICEF picture. At this moment, World War I, when so many of the children who had to be helped were actually children of the enemy, innocence had a very particular, the ostensible innocence of children served a very particular purpose.
Mhm.
And that was,
Mhm.
we're going to help, we're going to help these kids, even though we need to get food to this country. This is our enemy, but if we present it as children, we can deal with this political sort of issue. And so the innocence, and yet within those countries, the mobilization would be for around those issues would be very different. So I'm wondering how you intend to, the gaze from afar rather than the sort of domestic. Some of these are produced for a domestic audience, and some of them are produced for
Yeah,
foreign.
no, that's very, which is also the reason the Canadian government made, I think, the wrong decision to focus on women and children first when it comes to Syrian orphans, right? That's the same dynamic. And I think I might have got kind of derailed by that, when the past and the present kind of hit each other and you see it happening, it's always a little startling. So,
The question is basically sort of how to think about images that are intended to mobilize people domestically versus.
Yeah. Well, yes. The distinction that to me was the most obvious was the one I mentioned. Those images that are images of, I'll say it like other people's injustices that are designed to mobilize, typically a North American or European audience, right? As opposed to a sort of a more national self depiction. And so I think about that in the a lot in terms of things like, the way solidarity campaigns use images, but I hadn't thought about the way that would work also in terms of war and refugees. The simple answer would be, simple but not very satisfying answer would be, what has leapt out at me from the posters themselves, right? But no, that bears thinking about, for sure.
Before we descend to enjoy the food and drink of the reception, we should thank Karen again.